time for an answer. And again, I'm Josh Metz with Regional Government Services, and we're working under a contract with North Edge Finance doing economic development funding and finance technical assistance on behalf of Redwood Rise. And I know, recognizing most faces here, I see we've got a couple of our colleagues from RGS Land, Carrie Rogers and Bob Machuca joining us down from the south part of the state. And many of our colleagues that you all know each other much better than us, as you live in the same region. But we're really honored to have our friend Mark Northcross joining, and I'll just say a few brief words about Mark Northcross, who is a principal at NHA Advisors. He'll be able to tell you all about that. But I'll just say that I got to know Mark several years ago now, when he came to help navigate a very complex and ultimately successful public bond issue by the Fort Ord Reuse Authority in Monterey County. Really kind of interesting circumstances, but I was very impressed with Mark's deep knowledge of the process of how to do public debt financing processes. It's a super complex thing to do, and you got to know not only what the letters of the law say, but also how to interpret them and how to navigate different halls in Sacramento and access different experts across the state and the country to get these things done. So, just Mark is a municipal advisor. He's super skillful at working with public agencies to make these things happen. And when he read about our climate finance discussion, he reached out because, as you'll hear, he's got a passion for trying to address the impacts of climate change for our communities in California, especially. He's got some Northern California roots. For anybody way up in the Klamath River, he's got a little family compound up there, and maybe you'll mention that, Mark. But this is the Economic Development Finance and Funding Group that covers, of course, Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino, and Lake County. And I think the theme of the talk today is going to be regional collaboration. When all's said and done, the impact that can be achieved through well-organized, efficient, and effective regional coordination and collaboration. So with that as a bit of a rambling introduction, I'm pleased to pass the mic over to Mark to lead us through some interesting topics for the day.
Well, thanks, Josh. That was a very generous introduction. So before I talk briefly about my background, I'm just to do the screen share exercise. And I think Abigail and I got that all sorted out beforehand. So I press the share button, I press this button, and press one more button.
Layla pointed out that we do have occasional guests from Trinity, so not to be leaving them off. Okay. We also have our Trinity people.
Great. Well, again, Mark Northcross, NHA Advisors. I've been advising public entities, mostly in California, on how to, find capital and issue debt for over 40 years. I am not retiring. I'm already on Medicare. I won't give you my exact age, but I'm still working because climate change adaptation in particular is my passion, and I can't turn my back on it. And so I'd rather, I can either volunteer and do this, or I can get paid and do this. So, that's always a fairly easy choice to make. So we've been doing this, working on the climate change funding piece for about 7 years. And just to jump ahead to the conclusion, what I've learned is that grants is the most important part of it, and we'll take you through that. And the presentation starts out like we're talking about bonds and municipal debt, and it ends up talking about maximizing grant funding and ways to do that. So having said that, I'm going to go to the next page, starting with some public financing basics. I'm not sure what the expertise level of people is on the call, but let's start with a few basics.
There's quite a range just for you, Mark. There's quite a range of different levels. We've really worked at kind of level set with some basics here, but don't feel like you're. I think all of us appreciate the basics to begin with.
Okay, great. But again, some projects are too large to fund and pay as you go. It calls for debt financing. That's why we have municipal bonds. Some debt can be paid solely from existing revenues. These you don't need to increase taxes or revenues to pay for it. Other debt requires new revenue sources. In the state of California, if you need a new revenue source to pay for the debt, you're going to need voter or landowner approval. An exception sort of is on utilities, water, sewer, and electric. And I would say, please feel free to interrupt with questions. If I'm going to answer it on a subsequent slide, I'll let you know. Otherwise, please feel free to interrupt.
Hey, Mark, just how about the definition of debt means you do what? What are you doing?
You are selling the right to receive future revenues to a bond investor in return for them paying you money up front. You're saying, dear investor, I'm going to give you 5, 10, 30 years worth of these revenues. You define what those are on an annual basis, semi-annual basis. In return, you're going to give me so much money up front. I'm going to use that money to go build something or do some kind of project. So thank you, Josh. Okay, let's take a look at what the specifics to a high level are on debt financing in California, particularly what we call land secured financing. What that means is that one form or another, the security for the bond investor is tied to land, either through taxation or through actually a lien on parcels. General obligation bonds, which I believe is the most commonly used form of debt in the Redwood region, are secured by ad valorem property taxes, and it requires a 2/3 vote of the electorate. Supermajority, that's California, I believe, is the only state that has a 2/3 supermajority requirement for debt like that. You have parcel taxes. I believe there's a couple of them in the Redwood region. They also require a 2/3 vote. They are secured by a lien on the parcel. And I use San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority's Measure AA as an example. That was approved a few years ago on 2 million parcels in the 9-county Bay Area, multiple counties, obviously, multiple jurisdictions. And it was $12 a parcel, and 12 times 2 is 24 million a year. Assessment districts go back over a century. A great form of debt really stemming out of 100 years ago. The limit, it's tied to special benefit. You have to assess the parcel. It's like a parcel tax, but the limit is it's landowner approved, but the amount of the assessment is mathematically and legally tied to the amount of, quote, special benefit each parcel receives from the improvement. So the classic use of an assessment district is you got a neighborhood that doesn't have sidewalks. You're going to put in sidewalks in front of everybody's house. They get an assessment based on the linear footage of sidewalk in front of their house. That's a classic special benefit. The bad news is where it gets litigated, and oftentimes way too successfully, is where you make the argument as the property owner that, wait a minute, there's a general benefit here. Meaning, for example, the classic one, in Malibu, they did a special assessment district just for linear footage in front of people's homes. The Coastal Commission demanded that they do some community benefit improvements, coastal access, whatever. They tried to put those on the assessment district, and no surprise, the court came back and said, these are not special benefit. These are for people who don't even live in the district. Therefore, we're killing the entire assessment district. Doesn't work. So it's a niche financing. It's a great financing, but you aren't going to do anything at scale on an assessment district. The scale goes to parcel taxes, and a Mello-Roos district is essentially a parcel tax under the state constitution. Incredible flexibility, very powerful tool. Sea level rise funding. Most of our work in sea level rise has been in the San Francisco Bay Area, but so I'm using that as my example, but I believe this is a good example for certainly the greater Humboldt Bay area, Noyo and Fort Bragg, go down the list where you've got vulnerable property. Obviously, Crescent City is very vulnerable. We know that from the Alaska quake, 60 years ago. So no matter where you are on the West Coast, it's 50 to 150 million a mile, and I would say really 100 million a mile for your low-cost, nature-based horizontal levee solution. That is your low end. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Berkeley, California, or Arcata. You better start at 100 million a mile. If you go to a seawall, it's $1 to $2 billion per mile, whether you're in Seattle, Manhattan. That's just a number. The Bay Area has an estimate of $110 billion. And the engineering community and myself both agree, we think that is a lowball number. That I think that's, once you get into the weeds, the Bay Area is running 150 million a mile for horizontal levees based on the two projects we've had bid. Holistic funding is the key. I'm going to skip down to the last bullet. If you tried to do the 110 billion as a parcel tax on the 2 million parcels in the Bay Area, that means you're taxing parcels 100 miles from the Bay. At the same level you're taxing parcels on the Bay, which is, raises all kinds of political issues because you got to get a 2/3 vote. You're talking $3,500 per parcel per year for 30 years. Okay, let's put that, let's frame that. That's food money for families. $3,500 on a household, even in the Bay Area, you're talking food money. That is a big ticket. Holistic funding, going back to the earlier bullet, is the key. You got to get grants. You got to get public-private partnerships. You cannot realistically expect to fund this on the backs of taxpayers. I don't know what the cost per linear mile certainly applies, in my opinion, to Humboldt Bay and Del Norte County and Mendocino County. How many miles you have, I have no idea, but my gut feeling is you're looking at something comparable per parcel to deal with sea level rise adaptation. So hold that thought. Let's talk about wildfire. We are the municipal advisor to the Town of Paradise, as well as some other WUI, as we say, wildland urban interface communities in California. And we've been doing work on how to pay for it. Mitigation in two key areas: home, business, structural hardening, and then community scale wildfire risk mitigation. That means, I'll use Paradise as an example. You're going into the east side of town where the horrific campfire ignited, and you are going out there with goats, sheep, prescribed burns, or chainsaws, and you are managing ladder fuels. You're eliminating the best you can ladder fuels. What that means, brush between a few inches tall and 6 inches tall, 6 feet tall. And you can see it if you take a tour of Paradise. I'll use an example. They have a couple of old cemeteries in Paradise. Very mature ponderosa pine, which, as we all know, is really quite flammable. Virtually no damage. Nice cemetery lawns, gravestones, all of that. The cemeteries didn't burn. No ladder fuel. And obviously you step outside the cemetery and, you know, yes, the FEMA has cleared it all, but nothing's there. It's all gone. So community scale wildfire risk mitigation means you're going into the flammable, vulnerable periphery of a community, and on a regular basis, you're clearing ladder fuels. That costs money. And so while home and business hardening is a one-time cost, community scale wildfire risk mitigation is an ongoing annual funding requirement. That is an operating expense, getting more into a little bit into the accounting side. And, you know, I'll save comment on the proposed state bond issue, which proposing to fund ladder fuel reduction through a bond issue. And I'm thinking, okay, well, that's a nice thought, but, you know, we're funding an operating expense with the bond issue, which is not what we normally do. So we believe that, and we know this actually from talking to insurers in the Paradise and other communities, for them to get back into the insurance game on a reliable and an affordable basis, they got to see both structural hardening and they got to see those ladder fuels taken out on a regular basis. They got to see funding for both. The other piece about ladder fuels, I add the last bullet as kind of a little afterthought, but it's a big one in the long run. You go to scale on this, you can't haul this to landfills anymore, all the ladder fuel waste. You can't, and burn in place, you can do in small scale, prescribed burns, all that kind of stuff. You get to full scale, you aren't going to get an air permit from your air board. You've got to find some other way of dealing with the biomass. So hold that thought, but that is another obstacle to going to scale. Taxes. General obligation bonds at the local level, not at the state level, but local level, cannot be used to fund operating expenses. So the statute that prohibits local government doesn't apply to the state, but you aren't going to sell GO bonds, as we call them, to go fund your ladder fuel reduction. It's parcel tax. We've had a number of parcel taxes succeed in the WUI. Marin County, second wealthiest county in the state, got a $200 a house parcel tax approved. 70% yes vote, and they've got a $25 million a year budget now to do ladder fuel work in Marin County. I'm a resident, so I'm I'm very grateful for that.
And if I might just jump in a second, Mark, on that, you know, and I think it's important group, you know, one of establishing a revenue stream like that, like they have in Marin, is that of course then you have dollars that can be leveraged against others to grow the stack that can be applied to whatever the purpose is. So
Bingo.
you know, establishing these foundational revenue streams, even if they're, you know, the revenue doesn't meet the need or there are other desirable uses of dollars, just having a regular, consistent, reliable revenue stream is like invaluable in the work that we're trying to take on here.
Thank you, Josh. That is a really key point. As the people who do grants on this call know, you typically have a local share requirement. And if you've got, even if it's like, you know, not $200 a house, it's $10 a house, you have got a revenue stream to fund local share, and you get matching grants. You can leverage that so many ways. It is really crucial. Assessment districts can be used technically to do a fire station under litigation that goes back decades, to do ladder fuel maintenance and for community scale wildfire risk mitigation. That is a general benefit. It's not eligible for assessment districts. CFD is, again, parcel taxes is where you're going with this. 2/3 vote required. The Prop 5 on the state ballot will reduce the authorization level for bonds down to 55%, but not for parcel taxes or mellow roost taxes used for operating expenses. So that was, in my opinion, was an oversight. So, but hopefully we can fix it in the future. So if I was in person with you, and as Josh mentioned, I spent a lot of time in the greater Humboldt Bay and Humboldt County area over my adult life. I'm a member of the North Coast Co-op in Arcata, and we co-own with other families a little second home in Sums Bar just across the county line from Humboldt County and western Siskiyou County, and up on the Klamath for the middle Klamath, as we call it, for a couple of decades. I love to use a hockey stick as an example of the real primal challenge with dealing with voter approval for taxes for climate change. And the reason why is that nothing in nature is linear. We see temperatures in the northern hemisphere here, and it more or less matches a hockey stick, which means that it's exponential. It's not linear. It's kind of flat for a while, and then all of a sudden you get to that steep part of the curve, and it's just spiraling up really fast. And the question for voters is, they're used to voting even at 2/3 level for problems that are visceral, that they can see. Using the Bay Area as an example, traffic, transportation projects, or now fire resilience. People are losing their insurance on their homes. It's a lot easier to get a 2/3 vote when people are worrying about going on the FAIR plan or something. Sea level rise is not in that category, unless you're on the Gulf Coast, but not on the West Coast. And so we have this issue of how will voters approve a large debt issue or a large tax if we can't tell them when they actually need it? And the paradox, of course, is that by the time they actually need it, when the sea level is rising an inch a year or something, and you're starting to see king tide impacts and all of that, it's almost too late, because it takes years to go through the CEQA process, let alone as I'll explain, the Army Corps process to get the big grant. So I see this as a real issue. It's the biggest challenge we have, particularly on sea level rise. So the other issue is avoided costs. We're, typically say, oh, why don't we use EIFDs or, tax increment to go fund climate change? Well, the problem is mitigating of adapting to climate change doesn't generate any tax increment. It avoids the loss of tax increment. And our whole debt financing taxation system is not built around avoided costs in the future. We have no way of capitalizing that. We have no way of debt financing that. Avoided costs is something that we just don't really have a mechanism for dealing with. And climate change has got avoided costs written all over it. So, again, the bottom line here, how do we make avoided costs for rising sea levels or wildfire risk as visceral as overcrowded schools or gridlocked freeways? That is my way of phrasing what our core challenge is. So let's talk a little about putting things on the ballot. We've been doing that for a long time at our firm, and I'm just going to go through the classic questions and some of the responses you can have to that. Not every question has got a good response, but these are things that people very appropriately ask. Are my taxes going to pay for improvements that benefit me, or are they going somewhere else? You meaning, let's say it is sea level rise adaptation. Do people living, up the hill in Arcata, pay for sea level rise adaptation for people living down in Humboldt Bay? Classic case. And I've been in rooms, talked about that in the Bay Area, and I'll tell you, that splits the room in really fast. People who live on the hills don't necessarily see the benefit, and you have to explain to them, well, your freeway access and your access to Safeway and to Marin General is going to be lost, whether your home is in the inundation zone or not, which hopefully brings them around. My neighbor pays less than I do. Why? Well, it's Prop 13 and ad valorem taxes. When you have ad valorem, you don't have that with parcel taxes. How do I know we really need this tax? Well, that goes back to the fact that, is climate change real to the taxpayer? The big guys are not paying enough. It's unfair. If we have the time, a slide that shows what parcel taxes can be like I compared the absolutely spectacular, if you haven't seen it, Facebook world headquarters at the foot of the Dumbarton Bridge in Menlo Park with West Oakland under a parcel tax. It's quite the shocker. Um, I don't live in a wildfire sea level rise inundation zone. I should not have to pay. Um, Belarus law allows zones. You can mitigate some of this concern. That person's property gets a lot more benefit from this than I do. Why aren't they paying more? You get this question of benefit spread on any land secured tax, whether you think it's appropriate or not. Now we're getting back to the heart of the presentation. Let's move beyond debt, and I'm going to make a suggestion that the real takeaway for this group, if I'm doing a decent job, is not on the debt side, it's on the grant funding side. And so we've got, I think, Del Norte County, at least the city of Arcata on the call. And so I don't know who else we have from the public sector who's represents vulnerable communities, but this is a part, team, listen up. This is what I recommend you start doing now. Build a relationship with the one and only United States Army Corps of Engineers. They have been the primary funder of flood control, both riverine and coastal in the United States for over 100 years. Right now, it's 65% funding. Okay, that's 2/3. Let's just call it that. And there's no other funding source on the grant side that comes anywhere near that. And they do it at scale. Just for the heads up, the state of Texas, where you cannot use the term sea level rise, you have to call it storm surge from hurricanes, is way ahead of us and eating our lunch, in my opinion. They have a 20 billion B authorization from Congress to adapt to 3 feet of storm surge, not sea level rise, on the Gulf Coast, on the Texas Gulf Coast. That is about 100 times more than anybody in California has as an authorization, at least 100 times more. And the Army Corps is for real. People, I'm sure there's people on the call who've dealt with them that can be very frustrating and people get really tired of it. But when you're staring at the magnitude of what it costs for sea level rise adaptation at 100 million a mile, including Humboldt Bay or Del Norte or or Crescent City, you've got to go to the Corps. Sorry, however ugly your last experience may have been, you're going to have to make nice, and you're going to have to deal. That's my opinion. It may be bad. The worst news I give you on the call, but it's a strong recommendation. Let's look at the Bay Area as an example. I talked about 3,000 plus a house per year. Getting core funding knocks us down to 1,000. That's still not doable on a 2/3 vote in the Bay, but my God, 3,000 is impossible. And at least for most Bay Area households, it takes it out of the category of food money, as one of our council members in a disadvantaged community in the Bay has put it. To for $1,000 a year is food money in a lot of communities in the Bay, but not most of them that's okay. They can at least technically afford it. I mentioned again, Gulf Coast states in particular are partnering with the Army Corps. Texas, that $20 billion authorization is primarily going to go build tidal gates to protect the oil refineries in the Texas Gulf Coast. So, it means that you can protect major private property owners. And so that's one of the messages, certainly in the Bay, is that if you're Facebook, who's about, 18 inches or something above a king tide at the foot of the Dumbarton Bridge, you can get 65% core funding just to protect your own property. So it cuts both public and private. And I think that's very good news for dealing with major landowners. So we're going to do a little even deeper dive into the Army Corps. I have some examples here. The slide deck will obviously be available. Big money. The Corps does scale. Just remember, FEMA BRIC has got a $50 million cap. There is no cap on Army Corps. It's whatever you can get through Congress. So which is a hint to what's coming up, is that you're going to get to, build a relationship with, I think it's Jared Huffman and our 2 senators in California for California's Redwood region. For the North Coast, I'm getting, getting in the list for congressional authorization. And you can see New York, Texas, Louisiana, Chesapeake Bay. And at the very bottom, we have Alviso, the Silicon Valley Water District is no surprise is ahead of the game. They got 43% of a $550 million civil rise adaptation project at the south end of the bay funded. Great, it's 200 million and change. Texas got 20 billion. So, we can feel good about our measly 200 million, but they're, as I said, they're eating our lunch. A graphic display of why you need to, swallow your pride and go back to the core. If you can see my mouse, this is what it costs in the Bay with no grant funding. The core takes us from that big dark blue down to this light blue. This orange is where we live in the Bay. Oops, I just pressed the wrong button. As being electable, it's about $500 a house on a stretch. You can get elected in the Bay. It's less than 50% probability, but at least you can do it. To get down to that level, we have to cut, even with core funding, we have to get down to about 15, 20% being funded locally. That means you're doing public-private partnership, getting a state grant or some other third-party source of money. So this is a graphic display of what we're up against. And I apologize for the people who are not on Humboldt Bay, and I apologize for forgetting the name of Crescent City's harbor, but this is what you're looking at as your challenge.
Crescent City Harbor is the name.
Oh, okay. All right.
You got it.
All right. Well, thank you. I mean, again, I'm not picking on Texas. They are very generous with their time. The Gulf Coast Protection District and the Texas General Land Office. I've got Bay Area people on the phone with them. They've been very helpful. So if you need to call to find out how they went about getting $20 billion, they're happy to talk to you. What's the message here? Those 4 bullets under why. Cohesive and coordinated lobbying from the governor's office down to local government. Okay. It was a complete, total alignment of all the electeds in Texas, from city councils to the governor, totally aligning and lobbying. And I'll jump ahead. That means, actually the third bullet, comprehensive engagement by local staff with the Army Corps at all levels. What that means is that you are dealing with everybody from the summer engineering intern, and I'll explain we were the most successful entity in California in getting Army Corps funding, goes back to DC 6 times a year to the Pentagon. Once a year, they meet with none other than the presidential appointee, Assistant Secretary of the Army, not just the Lieutenant General in command of the Army Corps, that person's boss, which is the presidential cabinet level appointee, the Assistant Secretary of the Army. You engage at all levels. Coordinated grant application work. Right now, the Bay, San Francisco Bay, is doing it itsy bitsy. You've got probably a dozen different public entities filing uncoordinated apps with the Army Corps, trying to get into the word, as we call it, the Water Resources. God, I forget what the WRDA stands for. It's the biannual Army Corps authorization. We are not coordinated. And the last one is really important. Federal interest. That applies to the Army Corps, FEMA, other federal grant organizations. You have to demonstrate a federal interest. The easy no-brainer one is that Congress has made it really clear that where there's been hurricane damage, you have a federal interest. If that meant, for example, New York City has got their $60 billion project for basically New York Harbor, there's a federal interest because of Hurricane Sandy. We have not had any hurricanes yet on the West Coast. So we've got plenty of grounds for being inundated by sea level rise, but we haven't had a hurricane. So federal interest is a question.
But let's say up in Humboldt, with the interest in the offshore wind, could you see that becoming?
But yes, but the thing is, Congress, the whole Army Corps program is built retroactively to dealing with historical flooding, and I just perfect key into Sacramento. The first time that our state capital flooded catastrophically was in 1862. We've been dealing with flood in the greater Sacramento region for what, 160 years or more. And we've got federal interest all over Sacramento. Offshore wind, sea level rise is not explicitly defined by ancient congressional authorizations as a federal interest, which is, let's say we can't go to Congress and get that done. And we have lots of potential help all along the West Coast and any place left on the East Coast. I don't know, maybe Maine that hasn't had a hurricane. But we need to do that. But let's talk about SAFCA, the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency. Again, very generous agency with their time, helping people to understand how to work successfully with the Corps. They are a candidate for the most success. They are definitely the most successful Army Corps partner in Northern California and maybe in the entire state. LA County Flood Control District may have gotten more money out of the Corps for the Los Angeles River. I'm not sure about that, but they may have. But SAFCA has gotten $3.5 billion into the ground out of the Army Corps, not just authorization, into the ground. Impressive. And they use the examples where I got my stovepipe analogy. Yep, they meet with the Assistant Secretary of the Army once a year. Their staff is going back 6 times a year. They know the Pentagon really well. They know where to park, the whole thing. I mean, they can do that. They know their entire congressional delegation really well. And they have a long-term, and here's the key thing, it's called capacity on the operational side. As you can tell, I've got, again, Redwood region people here who are more on the lower income side and lower government funding side. Getting back to DC a half a dozen times a year is going to be a heavy lift for public entities in the Redwood region. Not to mention, dealing with the Army Corps is a very expensive proposition, demands a whole lot of staff time. Having staff available to deal with congressional offices on a regular basis is an expensive proposition. SAFCA, again, going back to the 160 years of flood, has what I call a legacy flood control assessment that's really robust. Their annual operating budget for staff is $9 million a year. So I'm telling people, if you want to go to scale on the Army Corps, jacks are better to get into that game is $9 million a year. Maybe we could design something for Redwood region that is a fraction of that, but I'll pull a number out of the air. If you aren't talking at least 1/3 of that, $3 million a year, I don't know how you can get into the game with the Army Corps. I'm just throwing that out there as a challenge. And I hope I'm wrong, but I'm going to say, if you really want to do this, it's $3 million a year. Someone else can have a comment. I heard some background noise. Okay, well, hearing none, again, feel free to interrupt. So the message here, SAFCA is our inspiration. They are an example. And to protect, the Redwood region coast from sea level rise, SAFCA is what we want to become in some way, okay? Scale is important for the long term. Going bit by bit under Army Corps funding, you have a lower chance of demonstrating federal interest. The Army Corps for San Francisco has made it clear we like the whole bay coming in. One big fat project. And we're much more likely to show federal interest if we lose the entire bay. I mean, you talked about offshore wind. Imagine losing both Google and Facebook to sea level rise inundation because both of them are vulnerable. If that isn't the federal interest, I don't know what is. So we got something there. So the bigger you go, the more likely you are to get federal interest. Regional concerns. The trade-off, formally incorporating multiple public and private entity stakeholders, is cumbersome, but the reward, as hard as it is and as frustrated as some people may have, they may have some history with the Corps here, the reward is way, way lower impact on taxpayers for doing this. Let's talk about extending this particular experience and approach to everything else. I got a list of the recent grant applications from the Redwood region. Congratulations, you guys are on your game, with one exception, and please accept this as a very friendly and well-intended criticism. We're seeing with all the federal grant funders, and certainly with the state grant funders that we work with, a theme. Multiple benefits for multiple stakeholders, whether it's a $200,000 grant or a $20 million grant, do better. Regional benefits through a formal implementation or governance structure of some kind. Demonstrated grant admin experience. That means the grant recipient may be advised to transfer the grant admin requirement to a local regional entity that can demonstrate they've got the experience in doing that. Bundling your small grant funding request into a coordinated master request. And just got off a call again today for probably the 15th time this year with somebody who's telling me about how EPA, they were coming in for a grant app and they did a pre-screening, and they got told that, wow, you have two disadvantaged communities and one federally recognized tribe. You go to the front of the line in our process. Again, the Redwood region is well positioned on this grant criteria. So the question is, I want to put on the table, and I'm nearing the end of the presentation, at least the formal part of it. Can the Redwood region rise, deliver this kind of grant support, coordination, collaboration, coordination, pulling the whole team together? We historically have thought about, coordination and collaboration on a county by county basis. I'm going to say again, respectfully, that works in urban Southern California or the urban Bay Area. When you get up to the counties of the size you are in the North Coast, and I'll include Trinity, and I'll include Siskiyou County in this, you're too small. You need to bundle together and come in as a coordinated group of counties saying, look, yeah, we've got like $200,000 grant apps in here for everybody, and all kinds of NGOs, Indian tribes, the whole shot. They're all bundled together. They're coming in under, the Redwood region, Joint Powers Authority, or whatever it is, and we've got grant administration handled. It's all taken care of. One-stop shopping. So that's the question I want to leave you with. Again, can Redwood region rise deliver this? Again, you get this feedback. You're coming in with multiple jurisdictions on a regional project. The grant funders want to see what the governance structure is for the multiple entities on the grant. They want to see an MOU. They want to see a JPA. It doesn't have to be a JPA, but it can be a memorandum of understanding. And the MOUs can include private sector parties. We just got a FEMA 50 million, I can't use the B's ears, grant app approved for the city of Menlo Park, Facebook, and PG&E. Okay, that was two private sector players and a public sector entity. They went in through a memorandum of understanding, and FEMA approved it. So that type of multiple stakeholder public-private partnership grant coordination is on the table. So with that, if we have the time, and I'm deferring to Josh and others on the call, I also see we have chat questions and you should probably deal with. Let me deal with those first. I want to talk, this is kind of a little editorial, so hold that thought. Let's look at the chats here.
I think in the chat, you're getting a lot of enthusiasm for your message,
Well,
which
okay, I just want to see if we have questions here. Okay, well, let's go through this social equity and local government taxation. Why am I putting this in here? When when you do a parcel tax, like we did in the Bay Area for the Bay Restoration Authority at $12 a parcel, you don't really care about social equity. When you start looking at $500 to $3,000 a parcel at that level, you better really be concerned about it. So I'm going to show you why. Sales tax, totally regressive. This is a hard number to believe, but in California, the lowest 20% they claim pay 7% of their net income on sales tax. You look at this going, sales tax is incredibly regressive. The poorer you are, the higher percentage of your income is paid for this. So we talk about taking, we're taking the sales tax in the Bay up to 10%, in all likelihood. That's going to be a serious regressive impact on our disadvantaged communities. Gas tax is totally regressive. It's the worst. You see it all over the world. Remember the yellow vest revolt in France before COVID, about 5 years ago? The yellow vests, they were burning McDonald's. I don't know what else. That was because France went to this big tax on diesel to pay, carbon tax, and the people just revolted for good reason. You can put yourself in the shoes of being a minimum wage worker with a long commute. How much of your income goes to gas tax? They claim here, we didn't do this analysis, but it was another outfit, 20% or 15% of your income in net income goes to pay gas tax. That's outrageous. It really is outrageous. And you look at like carbon tax, you're talking about doubling that. Be realistic. So that's the regressive issue. We're becoming aware of that around, not just in California, around the country, and frankly, around the world. Again, going back to the yellow vest revolt in France. Property tax, because of Prop 13, is not as regressive. It's because if you've been in your home for 30 or 40 years, you're way under taxed, but it's more random. We live in Marin County. We've been in this home for 33 years. We have young families as our neighbors. They're getting taxed probably 3 or 4 times what we're being taxed. That's just because, they bought the homes recently, and they're getting killed. But property tax, I would describe as being random. My last slide, comparing West Oakland to Facebook. This is actually more or less measure AA, our $25 million a year parcel tax for Bay Restoration, which is our primary funding for sea level rise in the Bay. West Oakland, if you haven't been there, it's very much a disadvantaged community, and legendary going back decades as a center of African American culture. West Oakland's paying $400,000 a year. They're very vulnerable. They're down at basically the Bay level. They're paying $400,000 a year. Facebook is paying $400 a year. And I show this to people in the Bay, just kind of going, "Oh my God." It's not a big political deal at $12 a parcel or $10 a parcel. If you take it to $500 per parcel per year, it is like devastating. It is just devastating. So that concludes my presentation. I'm going to stop the screen share. And thank you all for listening. And please go ahead and interrupt. And I hope the discussion is not about doing bonds, but about getting inspired to coordinate and collaborate to maximize your grant funding. And for our Sea Level Rise Vulnerable Communities team, you guys start working together and getting your long-term lifetime relationship with the Army Corps of Engineers. That's it.
excellent. Thank you, Mark, for that. I think you see in the chat a lot of enthusiasm for the message of collaboration and coordination. I know that Susan and her colleagues at CCRP and others are already talking. I know Amanda already talking and thinking about, durable structures that you know, and I know the whole California Jobs First initiative is trying to think about that, you know, how these regional activities can be made more durable. But I see here that Walter's got his hand raised patiently, so maybe we'll just go with the first question and then see where that takes us.
So it is more of an observation than a question. I believe that there will be some difficult work ahead to um, entice the tribes to become involved because of the fact that they have limited staff capacity. They're focusing on a lot of the same things that cities and counties are as well. And so it might need to be project specific, is where I'm kind of thinking it might need to be looked at with regard to pulling them in, as so that some of these things can move to the head of the line, if you will. And that is going to be difficult. We don't have tax bases. We can't get some of that bond stuff done. And so we really are on an unlevel playing field, and we recognize that and realize that and spend a lot of time trying to analyze and figure out different ways potentially to do some of the things that are necessary, particularly with regard to the ladder fuels reduction. And we do that a lot on our reservation, primarily through Department of Interior and our own money, the tribe's own money to take care of those things. And it really is a regional benefit, because when a fire comes up against the Hoopa Reservation, it typically goes out there, and that should be a good lesson for the people around us. So I'm more observing than I am having a question, and just kind of throwing it out there so that those discussions can start happening in the region itself. Thank you.
I think that is spot on, Walter. One of the things we have, believe it or not, in the very wealthy Bay Area, we have the same issue with there's no capacity for writing grants as a rule of thumb. What we have found, and I'll put this on the table as a notion, is in-kind services of employees from the public sector to assist in grant writing and also grant administration. And it's a backdoor approach, but right now, short of getting a major tax increase, it's one of the things we're looking at. It seems to be easier for public entities to do in-kind staff grant writing contributions to NGOs, including recognized tribes, than to actually submit money, provide money to help them. So I'll put that, thought on the table here.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna I know that Layla she's got herself in line here. But I'm thinking just for the Q&A, maybe we'll kind of end the recording so that we can kind of do